And now, Fastened Like Nails with Dr. Mark Hamby.
Hello, and welcome to today's podcast, Fastened Like Nails, featuring Mark Hamby and Molly Mayo. And I'm your host, Nina Coleman. No, just kidding. I'm a special guest.
Nina, it's great to have you here today. Welcome back to Lamplighter.
Nina was our Bindery Manager for a while,
Yeah.
and you graduated from the Masters Guild as well.
I did.
So we had our performance yesterday of Thespia and the Return of the King, and you and your brother came and saw the performance. Mm-hmm. What were your thoughts, Nina?
I thought it was beautiful and excellent and very creative, and it surprised me a lot in its ingenuity. I really enjoyed it.
Yay! Doctor, do you want to say anything about the performance before we jump into today's Bible lesson?
I'm pretty exhausted from the performance, but it was amazing. I don't think I've ever seen Lamplighter do anything like it. We had ballet, we had storytelling, drama. It was just really so well done. In the kingdom of darkness, there's no such thing as a king, death pretenders. We did it on Thespia, the most beautiful player of all.
Which is a book by Karen and David Maines, right? They did the Tales of the Kingdom, Tales of the Restoration, and Tales of the Resistance. And there's this one particular story that you've told at conferences for a long time.
Yeah,
and
probably 1,000 times.
Yeah. Well, can you tell a little bit about how you got started just loving that story?
Yeah, so I was just saved. It was in, probably August. I'd only been saved a month, and I was driving in Michigan. I don't know why I was there, but I was in Michigan driving a rent-a-car, and I heard David Maines on the radio telling the story in his own words, the story of Thespia, the most beautiful player of all. And when I heard it, I had to pull my car off the side of the road, and I was just weeping.
Whoa.
I'd never heard anything so beautiful.
So you heard an audio version of it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and I'll never forget, I don't know what possessed me to say this or pray this, but I said, Lord, if I could ever someday publish that story, I would do it. Yeah,
That's
it was
crazy.
just saved a month.
That's before Basket of Flowers.
Yeah. Oh, years, decades before.
Whoa.
It's so crazy that was just your first thought to pray that
Yeah.
specifically.
Yeah, and then sure enough, we're publishing those books now.
Cool.
I think they're probably right up there with Pilgrim's Progress. Yeah, as far as the anointing of those stories. Yeah, it grabs me every time. I usually start the story off by saying, long ago in the Enchanted City, a place where there's no trees, no sky above, no birds that sing, only hardship and misery. But Thespia's mother told her there was a real king and a real kingdom, and the sunset was beautiful. But Thespia refused to believe because for her, seeing was believing. Even in her mother's dying breath, she begged her daughter to believe, but she would not because she could not. Because for Thespia, seeing was believing. Once her mother had died, the enchanter and his men came to take her away. They were going to brand her. You see, children who were orphaned or deformed in any way were branded either at birth or when a parent died, or if they were deformed. They were placed underground to put the hot coals in the furnaces to keep the man-made power going. Nothing real in this kingdom, like I said. No trees, no sky. And the enchanter had called the day night and the night day, and the people slept during the day and worked during the night. It was forbidden to see light. No one thought that a king would ever return, but just then, Thespia was rather than being branded, she was taken to the Palace of Players, where she would become one of the actresses, where once a year the enchanter allowed the people with their runny sores and haggard clothes and lack of hope come to the great theater to forget their sorrows for a season. It was there that Thespia would come out on stage and the people would chant, Thespia, Thespia, we love Thespia.
Thespia, Thespia, we love Thespia.
As she walked out on stage, everyone told her that there were tensions, be careful. There were rumors that there was a rebellion on hand. But all of a sudden, Thespia came on stage and took her bow. And when she did, she noticed something very peculiar. There was a man standing what appeared to be in his own light. All of a sudden, the man-made power turned off, and everything was dark, and people cried out, the children. You see, when there were power outages in the Enchanted City, one of the children would be severely beaten, and one child would die for not keeping the hot coals in the furnaces to keep the man-made power going. But not tonight. The man who was standing in the back of the auditorium began to walk forward, walking in his own light. He walked to the edge of the orchestra pit, vaulted up on stage, and said, "This is where I make my entrance." Looked at the orchestra and said, "Music, down tempo." They obeyed his voice, didn't even know why. Just then, the man looked up at the people and at the actors and said, "Have you ever heard of a kingdom where every orphan had a home?" "No," said the people. "Have you ever heard of a kingdom where the king lived in it and loved his people?" "No," said the people. "Have you ever heard of a kingdom where the king lived in it and made everything right?" "No," said the people. Just then the man looked at the orchestra and said, "Music, up-tempo." The music was infectious. Again, they obeyed his voice and didn't know why. "In the kingdom of light," said the man, "everything's right." "Ah," sighed the people. "In the kingdom of light," said the man, "the day shines bright." "Ah," sighed the people. Day, light, they'd never seen it before. Just then Thespia walked up to the man and said, "Sir, how do we find this kingdom of which you speak?" And the king looked at her, or the man looked at her, don't want to give it away, and said, "The real kingdom is wherever I walk, and anyone who walks with me. Follow me," said the man. She didn't know what to think, but all of a sudden she rubbed her eyes and looked again, and everything in the auditorium was changed. Everything and everyone was changed. The people in their runny sores were now healed. The haggard clothes were turned into something beautiful. Their lack of hope was turned to joy. She rubbed her eyes and looked again, and sure enough, everything was changed, but only as she looked at the people through the man's light. Just then she knew who the man was. She looked at him, and tears began to flow, but not players' tears, but real tears. The man took the back of his hand and began to wipe away her tears, and she had never been touched so gently and so warmly in all her life. She took the man's hand in hers, and as if giving an introduction, she raised it high and said, "My people, your king. My king, your people." All of a sudden, the lights blazed forth, and someone in the wealthy patron boxes shouted out, "There's no such thing as a king. Death to pretenders." And the people started to chant,
Death, 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 death,
they said. The man began to button his coat as if he meant to leave. Are you leaving?" she said. "Yes, the moment for believing has ended." And the two of them left the theater together, and very few seemed to see them go. And Thespia became a street player in the back alleys and dead ends of Enchanted City, acting out the king's story in such a way that all who saw her suspected and then hoped that there was a real king and a real kingdom. And like the king, she wore common clothes, and she never gave the luxuries of the palace a backwards glance, because when one has found one's real love, it is easy to leave behind what has only been pretend.
That is such a beautiful story.
Isn't it?
Okay, so quick background. I leave for my sister's wedding for 2 weeks, and this little story of Thespia had just begun to start. Like, Rainey on staff, she was like, "We should do Thespia as a stage play," and so it was just kind of simmering.
Right.
Yep.
And Rainey's our sound engineer today. Rainey,
She
you're the one that
is.
gave us that idea, huh?
Uh-huh.
Wow.
And so there the idea was just like barely starting, and I leave for a couple weeks.
That's when
and
this all started, just before you left?
Yep. And so
wow.
I'm gone, and then things are happening, and, my sister gets married. Everything's wonderful. I come back here, and they are doing rehearsals for Thespia. And I was like, what in the world? And so here I am. And so when I had heard about it, I'm in Maine, and I was like, well, I should look up that book if we're actually going to do it. And so I open it up, and my little brother was real sick. And I open it up, and I've not read it before, and I just start reading to him, and I'm like crying through this story. And he was asleep long before I finished it. He was just like pretty tired. But I'm just reading it like more for myself now at this point. I'm reading, I'm like, I was like, because when one is found, one's real love. It's easy to leave behind once to leave it for dead. And I close the book, and I look over, and he's like conked out. So then I get here, and there's, Frank as the enchanter, and he comes out, and he's like, wait, the child is mine, and everything's
Take
like
her to
intense.
my palace.
And yeah. And, Doctor, you're working on the script, and we're just sitting there that first rehearsal, and we just kind of look at each other, and we're like, let's make this awesome.
Yeah.
And, everything is lovely. From the choreography, we have Amelia on staff.
I wish we had it on video so people could see it. We'll have to do it again. Actually, we're going to be doing it in 10 days.
Yeah. Yep.
In Italy.
Italy.
Actually, Sicily. So It's amazing that God opened that door for us. And who knows where God will take it next.
Yeah. Okay, but then at the end of it, you say something about Thespia and the players of the king, and then it kind of goes on from there.
Yeah, it's not just Thespia. Then they go to the back alleys and they start acting out the word of God, telling people to repent, to come to the Lord, and then it ends with this amazing crescendo of the Beatitudes sung in Italian.
Yeah.
And not only did they do all of that work with Thespia, but they also had to learn an entire chorus in Italian.
In Italian, yeah.
That was...
And another interesting part of it is that just a few hours before we performed, we probably looked like Thespia and the players, like running around the whole town of Mount Morris. One group down one corner, another down another. We've got like flyers and programs, and we were praying, like, Lord, please let us, talk to this neighbor or that person, and then they'd pull up in their driveway, or we turn a corner and there's a kid on a bike, and
Answers
we're like,
to
wait
prayer.
a minute,
everyone we prayed for, except for two people. Literally would walk out their front or back door, and we were right there handing them a flyer to come to that night. And it was a packed house. It was really phenomenal.
A lot of people who hadn't been here before.
Yeah, probably 30% new people.
Lots of families.
So, Miss Nina, we're going to let you go because we know you have a 4-hour drive.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
But it's been lovely.
Day.
Okay.
Bye, Nina.
We'll see you soon. Keep in
goodbye.
touch. Stay in the Word, and we love you.
Love you too.
Okay.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Cool. Thanks, Nina. That was cool. That was fun.
It was so lovely to see Nina. We had some actually Masters Guild alumni at our performance last night.
It was great seeing everybody.
The first one,
Caleb was here.
He gave us the standing ovation. He jumped right up there and started clapping away, and then
really?
Nina and Miles jumped up.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, with Caleb, the other Caleb.
Yeah.
His sister was here.
Caleb's and families of the students. I always love seeing students' families.
Oh, that's right. We had all the families here,
all these
too.
little girls running around.
Okay, so this story, Thespia, the most beautiful player of all, it has been greatly used of the Lord over the years, and it comes in a trilogy. Tells the kingdom is first, tells the resistance is second, tells the restoration is next. And if you've never read it, I highly recommend it. Now, it's a little scary for really young children, I'd say probably.
It's more text heavy too. So I think like if you've got a family with even just a lot of different ages, it's a really nice one to read because, here I am at, my age and I'm loving it. And I think teenagers all the way down to like 9.
Yeah, it's nine and up.
Yeah. 9
and up, but I think the sweet spot's going to be 16 to 25, 16 to 30. It's an anointed story. All of them are. The Baker Who Loved Bread, Princess Amanda and the Dragon, Old Mercy. They're just
so they're not just well-written stories. They have these powerful allegories to them where you're reading and, you're just blown away by the truth that's in there. And that's something that we've heard from, was it Warren Gage who said that the best stories have the gospel message in them?
Gospel message, and they're both juvenile and adult. Yeah. They reach both ages. And not only that, but these stories were first written when I believe Karen was working with some women in an abused women's shelter.
Whoa.
So a lot of the allegory, comes from the real life situations that she was in during that time. Yeah, they wrote these stories, and I've been reading them now for close to 45 years at least.
That's amazing.
I'll never forget the very first time I used to read Thespia at the end of one of my seminars, and it was my main seminar, and one day I forgot the book, and I stood up there and I looked at everyone and said, "I'm so sorry, I have a story, but I didn't bring the book." And someone yelled out, "Tell it in your own words." And I started to tell the story, and the next thing I knew,
you had it memorized.
I had it memorized, didn't even know it.
Crazy.
Isn't that something?
Yeah,
and that's
crazy.
when I started telling the story without the book itself. And I think I've changed it quite a bit since that time.
What an amazing moment. Like, forgot to do that, but also that they said that because I wouldn't think to yell that at a speaker.
I know. Yeah, that was really special. Okay, but this story and the fact that the gospel is in it, and that we learned that all good stories, all great stories have the gospel woven in it. For example, Cinderella, Snow White, Tell us about that, Molly. Some of the things you've been learning about that.
Yeah, so it was interesting because we were asked as a group, which of all of the children's stories have been the most timeless, the most classic, the one that you see in so many different languages and cultures and versions, and it was Cinderella. And we're like, what? That's crazy. But then he started to unpack kind of the gospel message in it. There's a prince, and he, she runs away, but he pursues her, and there's redemption.
And she's taken captive too.
She's been taken captive, by the stepmother, and they were jealous of her. And so there she is, and, the rags to riches kind of idea. And, it's just...
And the same thing with Snow White. So all of these classic stories have a portion of the gospel woven throughout them.
They have morals in them, which is something that I know we're really passionate about. Even something simple like in Snow White you mentioned, the hag. So the step queen is gorgeous. She's beautiful. But then when she wants to, tempt Snow White with the apple, she makes herself an ugly hag, just like how she is on the inside. And so there's that element of allegory where that's how she is on the inside. So when kids are reading, it's a beautiful story. Like princesses, I love the story of princesses, but they need to know that there's a prince and that he's coming. It's not just a romantic love story. It's, although that is part of it, it's that bigger story.
Well, and it's also, again, it goes back farther than that because it talks about the gospel and God's love for mankind and how God is trying to reach us, and then how Satan, the real Satan, with his ugliness gets in there, but he tempts us with beauty.
Totally. Yeah, totally. And then there's, Snow White, and she's, in this spell, and she's dead, and the prince comes and kisses her and brings her from...
And you have the drop of blood.
You know? They knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
They definitely did.
Yeah. And they tapped into that early on, and that's why people fell in love with these stories, because they do have parts of the gospel that are woven throughout that story, which makes these stories timeless. And so we've gotten away from that. We've gone from the gospel-centered stories, even the children's stories that we love, right? These classics. What made them classics was the gospel. And then now it's gotten so far political and right. They don't have any semblance of them whatsoever. And you watch them on a movie or you read it in a book, and they're not classics anymore. People don't talk about them. Yeah,
they go for more of the shock factor, or what can we do that's different? And I feel like they don't know what they broke. They broke the system, but they don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've noticed this, but how many remakes are there right now? It seems like every movie that's coming out is either a remake or a part 2, part 3, part 4. There's nothing beautiful and original because they just don't understand. Disney back in the day, he understood what it meant to make a beautiful story. And it's kind of moved this direction where it's no, the princess doesn't need no prince. She's totally fine on her own. And it's just interesting to see that. And that's what you see reflected there.
So... You've been reading some books by Jean Edward Veith. Let's list some of the books. First, from Postman, you've got...
Amusing Yourselves to Death.
The Disappearance of Childhood.
Yep.
Reading Between the Lines, Jean Edward Veith.
And we've got Blue Suede Shoes. I haven't read all of these books,
Turmoil in the Toy Box.
Some of them for sure. Yeah, and then...
Honey for a Child's Heart.
Yeah, Terry Glaspie wrote this, Child's Imagination... Children of a Greater God.
Thank you, Greater God. Yeah, that's an amazing.
That one was amazing.
So we have access to some of the most important books that help you to understand what makes a great story. And parents are trying to find literature for their children. There's 2.5 million books every year printed in the world.
Yeah.
And of those 2.5 million new books, I would dare say that most of them, 99.9% of them, are bad for your children. The book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, says, "My son, beware of anything beyond these." Beyond what? Then it says, "The making of many books there is no end, and such, is damaging to your flesh." The making of many books there is no end.
And much study is wearisome to the flesh.
Study of what?
Study of books.
Study of books. What kind of books?
Books that are outside of the 3 things that he outlines in that.
And he names 3 types of words.
Yep. Words of delight,
words of truth, and words of wisdom. So God has given us parameters, filters to judge what books are good for our children, which books are bad for our children. And God says, here's the standard. And God warns us. He says, beware. Anything beyond these 3, words of delight, words of truth, and words of wisdom. Now, how would we define words of delight?
Oh, okay. So it sounds like, the word delight is something that gives you pleasure, but there's also a bad kind of pleasure. So, being able to discern what a good book full of delight is. So a helpful thing, we've talked about this a lot, is the book, when you're reading it, is it refreshing? Is it fulfilling? Is it, satisfying me? And when I'm walking away just like, oh, whoa, that's amazing. That's beautiful. Or is it like, oh, I want to keep reading. You know what's going to happen. And you walk away and you just feel a little empty, or like a little bit like, oh, it was just such a trashy waste of time.
Okay, so that's a really perfect way to describe that. How do you feel when you're reading the book?
Yeah.
Does it make you feel more depressed, in despair, uneasy? Okay, so there's a compunction of feeling here. There's you have this moral sense. I think I'd call it a moral compunction, where you are moved, in your spirit. You're moved in one direction or the other. There's no gray areas in reading and in life.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's either good or bad. It's either evil or righteous. No middle ground. So the things that our children read, if they're reading something and it's breeding, cultivating this contempt within inside their soul, this uneasy feeling, or if it's causing them to be more selfish, lustful, if it's putting things in their mind.
Or just filling them with nonsense,
Yeah.
Like the books that the kids are reading, my little brother was really excited to read Dog Man. He's like, it's so cool. And my mom, I was privy to the conversation. She's like, well, what do you like about it? And he's like, it has no swears. She's like, what? She's like, are you kidding me? Like, and she had to have that conversation with him. Like, no, we don't read that. That's not a good book. And so,
why wouldn't it be a good book?
Because it's just full of nonsense. And we have this whole scene in Tip Lewis where he's there with the naughtiest group of boys, and they're laughing in each other's faces and just like making fun of each other and like saying nursery rhymes, just like talking complete nonsense. And they think it's the most hilarious thing in the world.
And they do think it's hilarious.
Yeah.
So simple kids. So they're, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves.
Like
but
13 or 14.
There are 6 types of kids in the world. It starts off as everyone starts off simple, meaning thoughtless, gullible, naive, fathead, empty head. That's the way the Hebrew word describes the word simple. They're thoughtless. They don't think things through. Okay, and we got a new book coming up here called Kelly Nash.
Yeah.
Holy smoke, that book is amazing.
I think it'll be out this week, so you guys can order it by the time this goes out.
That's going to be one of the most life-changing books Lamplighter's ever printed.
Yeah, it's well written.
Just because parents are always talking about, what were you thinking, right?
I wasn't thinking.
This book is going
I
to help.
didn't mean to. I wasn't thinking.
Children to think before they act. It's very. If I had read this book when I was a kid, it would change me.
That's a key thing you said. Children. And so, Paul talked about, like, do you want to stay as children or do you want to, like, move forward in life? Kids, they need something to aspire to. And in one of the books I was reading, I think I was reading between the lines, it was saying kids don't, like, look at these books and think, whoa, I want to do what's right and I want to whatever. They're kids, They're reading, they're like, whoa, I want to be like Jimmy. I want to, like, be like Bobby.
Yep.
Like, and what is it about Jimmy or Bobby? Like, oh, well, he's really good at sports or whatever. So whatever it is in the story, kids need to be looking at role models who are living out, truth and delight and wisdom. And that's the ideal that they're giving them to aspire to. See a little boy, like I'm in the kitchen and I'm making a meal for our family. And my little 6-year-old brother, he comes up and he's washing dishes. And I look over and I'm like, Johnny, what are you doing? And he's like,
this really happened?
Yep, this happened. And I look over and he just quietly, he was sitting there like coloring or doing something, but there I am making the meal and he just comes right up and he's doing it. And so I look over and he's got like suds everywhere. And so I'm watching him, I'm like, why are you doing that? And he just looks up at me with his big brown eyes and he says, well, Daddy washes dishes every morning. He's like, so that's what I'm doing. And I looked down at him and it like hit me in this way, like little boys are watching their dads.
Yes.
And not just that, but like little girls, like, how do I know how to show love to someone if I haven't seen that from my mom? Or how do I know how to have good people skills if it wasn't emulated? And so we are people who, you see someone doing something spectacular, you want to be like them. And that's what books do when you read them and you're like, whoa, I want to be like this person.
Yeah, they need that desperately.
Yeah.
And they also need the opposite, where I don't want to be like that person. So it needs to be both in the story.
Yes, absolutely.
The antagonist as well as the
how important it is.
hero.
And you always talk about the Scarlet Letter and about how in that story, I remember reading it for like a class or something, and I was like, oh, well,
You
all
empathize
of a
with the wrong
sudden,
person.
adultery is not that bad. And I had to stop myself. I was like, what in the world? How am I thinking that? Like,
Yeah.
oh, I wish they could be together. And I'm like, they can't be together.
No.
This is wrong. It's
Right.
bad.
Right.
This is bad. But that's the power of a well-written story. They are dangerous.
Call of the Wild does the same thing. Yeah, the survival of the fittest, you think that's the way it should be. Yeah. Okay, so back to the 6 types of children. So everyone starts off as a simple person. And then Solomon writes in Proverbs chapter 1, you got simple, and then if you're going to move from simple, then you become knowledgeable, a youthful, knowledgeable person. The young men, they're all throughout the Bible. David's young men, Saul's young men. Some were foolish, some were wise. So you go from simple, thoughtless, naive, gullible, to knowledgeable. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The way you move from a simple person to a thoughtful, youthful person, a knowledgeable person, is to start fearing God. Fearing God is the key to the next level. That's what God then opens the mind to knowledge. It opens the heart to understanding. So it starts with the fear of the Lord. You get connected with, okay, I want to hate what God hates and love what God loves.
That's amazing.
So you go from simple to knowledgeable, from knowledgeable to wise, from wise to discerning. Those are the 4 steps of virtue. They go ascend, simple, knowledgeable, wise, virtues. Proverbs chapter 1. If you don't move into knowledge by fearing God, then if you don't fear God, then you go backwards from simple to foolish.
Okay, so you take like a child, let's say they're simple, because you said everyone starts off that way, and all of a sudden, let's say I'm the simple person, and I do something that's not okay. Maybe I say something rude to my friend or whatever, and then I get corrected. Would you say that's a pivotal moment, like the correction element? That's kind of going to just
Extremely pivotal, and that will determine what direction you're going to go.
Fascinating.
Okay, so watch this. So,
okay, yeah.
So the fool, if you go backwards, the simple becomes a fool, because fools, guess what?
What?
They, according to Proverbs chapter 1, fools hate knowledge.
That's crazy.
And the reason they hate knowledge is because they reject fearing God.
That because it proves them wrong.
Yeah, they don't like to be wrong.
And so people who cannot admit that they're wrong will never grow.
Right, you can't go to knowledge,
that's amazing.
Wisdom, or
which isn't it the converse? So isn't it like those who grow in knowledge, it delights their soul or something?
Yeah, they love being corrected.
Yeah.
Yeah, correction is a delight to them.
It's crazy.
Because once they start growing and they realize there's a lot they don't know, that when someone does correct them, they're like, oh, thank you. Stubborn kids, they don't want to be told what to do because they think they know what's best.
Yeah, especially kids that are smart.
So a fool hates knowledge. You go from simple, you either go simple, knowledgeable, wise, discerning, or backwards, simple, foolish. And after you become a foolish person or a fool, you hate knowledge.
You start being attracted to other fools and you want to hang out with them.
Worse, you start becoming a mocker.
Ooh.
And yes, you want to hang out with other ones. Your like attracts like. But now the last step is you become, semi-last, you become a mocker. And you start to mock others. Why? It says mockers delight in their mocking. Why do they delight in their mocking?
Because it makes them feel good about themselves.
It covers their
power struggle.
It covers their shame.
It sounds like an insecure person.
It is very insecure. And then lastly, they become haters. So you've got, it's actually 7. So in the middle, you've got the simple. They go simple, knowledgeable, wise, discerning, or simple, foolish, mockers, haters. That's all in Proverbs chapter 1. So back to
Kelly
our
Nash.
delight, truth, and wisdom. Oh, or Kelly Nash. Yeah. So Kelly Nash has all of those.
Yeah.
He's in every one of those. And that book is coming out soon. And mom and dad, grandparents, if you've not read Kelly Nash, Out on a Limb, it's called Kelly Nash, Out on a Limb. It is a life-changing book, a life-changing story that's going to help children to start thinking before they act.
Yeah.
Wow, what a story. Okay, so now back to Ecclesiastes chapter 12. God says, my son, beware, the making of many books, there is no end. 2.5 million books today. Every year.
We're a publishing company. You'd think that'd be kind of discouraging to read.
Yeah, right. The making of many books, there is no end, meaning like there's countless books being printed every year.
Yeah.
A lot of writers out there, and a writer's writing what? He's writing his own worldview.
Oh, yeah. It's impossible. And I'll say it again. It is impossible to write without infusing your worldview into what you write.
That's exactly right. Impossible.
Because the best writers are always honest. And so like you're talking about Call of the Wild, they believe that life is pointless and it's just like survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
And so because he was a good writer, he wrote that into his works.
Right.
So you're either going to give your kids trash that has like maybe, I don't know, whatever worldview, or if you get them the best literature, you still even have to be careful with those.
Harry Potter, all of this dystopian literature. I've had parents contact me and say, hey, we're going to read this to our kids, but we're going to do it systematically. We're going to teach them about why these stories are bad. And I tell parents, I said, if you do it, you are going to hurt your children. And here's why. Because these stories, they create an emotional attachment to the characters. And once there's an emotional attachment, it doesn't make any difference how much you read, how little you read. There's going to be an emotional attachment. That's how they're written.
Yeah.
Once there's an emotional attachment created, you change your worldview. You start to think like they think. You start to be on their side. And once that happens, especially with dystopian literature, that's what. Look at our society today.
Yeah.
It's completely dystopian. You know, and they're trying to create their own utopia. How are they doing it? Creating their own set of rules. All it is replacing an old set of rules with their own new set of rules. And they're saying, like, we're going to do this because we want to bring real love in this. Their real love is just selfish love. It's one more selfish love after another.
Yeah.
You know, so it's the stories just being rewritten by the same types of authors with the same worldview that lacks one main thing, the fear of God. Because that's the true beginning of knowledge. The real knowledge is with God, always has been with God, and is found in the Word of God. And there's nothing absolute truthful outside of the Word of God. I mean, that's where it is. And so if you want your children to really learn true knowledge, you read the Scriptures, you study it, you show them the beauty of the Bible. It's so amazing. This, Emily was sharing this morning about the story of David and Abigail. Wow. So amazing. You know, Abigail in the center of 1st and 2nd Samuel is the center of the whole thing. And it's dealing with what? Abigail, the word Abigail means I think it's the glory of the Father.
Ooh.
And David is the beloved, and Nabal is the fool. So you've got the beloved, the glory of the Father, and you've got the fool all there. And you've got this real allegory going on in the middle of 1st and 2nd Samuel. When children get to see it like that, how it's written, not just why it was written and what was written, but how it was written, the beauty of it. So, okay, back to Ecclesiastes. Delight, truth, and wisdom. God says, anything beyond these, my son, beware, anything beyond these, it will hurt you. It will harm your flesh. I believe it's going to harm their soul. Lot's righteous soul is vexed from day to day by the things he saw and things he heard. That word delight, Molly, is an amazing word. It carries more than just delight. And you said something interesting earlier. You said when a child reads it, you know, does it delight their soul? Does it make them feel good about what they're reading?
Yeah.
Do they want to know more? They don't want to put the book down, right? You know, so this is what the word delight means. It's chafetz is the word. Not just delight, but brings pleasure, a moral pleasure, purity in pleasure.
Oh, that's good.
It also is this idea of a longing, one in which someone takes great delight in. And then it has this idea, it leaves in your heart and in your soul more to be desired, more of the same to be desired. You want more of that same desire. And it carries the idea of something that is extremely valuable.
Ooh.
And so the books our children read.
Something of weight, importance.
Yeah. These things need to be weighty in their lives. They're like, oh, I want this. And it's like one more key on the chain that I've read something that has strengthened my character. It has changed my values.
Yeah, as you're speaking, makes me think of David saying, you know, in your law I delight. He talks a lot about delighting in God's word and in his law. And what's interesting about reading these books is that even though it's convicting, like being convicted is not always really fun. It's like, oh, I just said a mean thing, or, oh, I'm having a bad attitude right now, whatever it is. When you're reading a book, and maybe it's not like, ooh, this is so happy, like butterflies in Happy Land. Like if I'm reading it and I'm like, oof, ooh, like that's convicting. Then when you follow that and you pursue that and you strive to be that person with the Lord's help, there is such great delight that you can like hold the book up like you do at all those conferences and say, this book changed my life.
Yeah.
And
Basket of Flowers, Teddy's Bud.
That is the lasting delight of the books. It's not that temporary like, oh, that is just like so fun and I love that or whatever, because we gravitate towards as a culture, the popular books, they're fun to read or whatever, but do they bring that lasting delight and pleasure? Does it linger with you when you're, weeks away from a book? Are you still talking about Tip Lewis?
I look back at some of my books and I look at them as old friends.
That's really cool.
I still got them all underlined and dog-eared. And
we get to benefit from that in the library, like reading the notes and the highlights and the underlines, and it's just cool. Like it changes you.
I had great times with my books. Okay, so that's one of the priorities of reading, knowing what to read and why we should read it. So God says books that have words of delight, that bring value and pleasure, a wholesome moral pleasure. You feel good about what you're reading. You want more of the same. Okay, you're like, oh, I got to have more of this. I mean, the books we publish here. I mean, we read a book and it spoils us, right? Because the next book, who would have ever dreamed that we'd find a book better than Teddy's Bud and find Tip Lewis?
I know, isn't that
and
crazy?
then we'd find a Kelly Nash.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's
Come
just
what
crazy.
may.
Yeah. It dwell deep even.
Dwell deep,
Some of those Amy Lefevre. I'm really excited about Dear Olive.
And, how about the new one you're working on right now? The
Standing Strong?
No, not Standing Strong. The one you're working on, Shut In to Serve.
Oh, Shut In to Serve. That's funny. I said Standing Strong, but my brain was thinking Shut In to Serve.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, that one is unique.
It is unique, but it's good.
That one's for like people who work in the ministry in the church and
oh no, I think it's for
discipleship
everybody.
opportunities.
Oh, farmers. It's got everything in it.
I think it has everything in it, but it has that special pull that I would really like encourage youth pastors and people who are in the ministry with this book, because you just see this boy who is literally shut in to serve, and all of the boys flock to him, and he gets to see just, he can't get out and do things like other people.
He's in a wheelchair.
And he has this influence on the boys just because
Everybody.
he's ministering. And so I think it's such an important book for people in the ministry to be like, well, what I do matters even though I may not see it for years and years and years. Like,
just the fact that we get to print these books and that God keeps giving us books that seem to get better and better and better. I just love it.
I think everyone on staff loves to read and edit and review the book. We can't wait to see the book covers too.
I know.
We make them look beautiful.
You can judge a book by its cover here.
Yeah.
Okay, so lastly,
praise God.
you got Solomon says, beware, my son, of anything beyond words of delight, words of truth. So whatever parents read to their children, have their children read, the book has to present absolute truth.
Yep.
And absolute truth cannot be found, hear me out, cannot be found outside of the Bible. Did you know that?
Yeah.
There is no absolute truth outside of the Bible. You can't come up with a truth that's outside the Bible. All of God's laws, all of God's thoughts are found in the Word of God. But so we take those thoughts, and we can craft now a story with the Word of God's teaching in mind. That's why Cinderella was such a great story, because it was based on absolute truth. So delight, truth, and then wisdom.
Yeah.
Wisdom is knowledge lived out in a beautiful and skillful way. The word wisdom, chakma, in the Bible, is the word for skillfulness. It's negotiating life skillfully and beautifully.
That's cool.
Yeah, and so that's what it should do to a child. And they read these stories like, oh, I want a child, after they read a story, they should be like, I want to do that just like that and better.
It's good.
Yeah.
It's not just head knowledge. It's how do I, because we're presented with choices every single day. Even what you're talking about with it becoming a simple or a foolish person,
Look at Basil. Basil, honesty in industry.
Basil? He's lazy.
Yeah,
he goes in the forest and meets a woodcutter.
Then he hears the story from his Sunday school teacher, and he goes home. He makes his own broom. He starts sweeping up the floor. He starts pulling the weeds out of the garden. Next thing you know, his father joins him.
Yeah, and then his mom.
Transformed life. Just because.
Simple acts.
He starts to see wisdom lived out before his very eyes. And so we are what we read. And I don't know if you know this, but only 5% of the entire North American continent is reading nonfiction or anything of value today. There was a study done in the 1980s, actually. That's 40 years ago, 40 plus years ago.
So sad.
Yeah. And so we've got to get children reading again, but the only thing that we've got to get them to read first is stories that will compel them, that will attract them. You know? So a junior high librarian once said to me that she gives these kids these stories that deal with all kinds of bodily fluids.
Ew.
It's the grossest stuff, right? I don't know what they're called. Goosebump books. I don't think they're called that, but whatever they're called, they're just terrible books.
Okay.
And all kinds of crude stuff in them, yeah. And worse than that today. But she said to me this, so at a library conference, and she said, we don't care what they read as long as they're reading. And I'm like, seriously? I said, we should care very much what they're reading, because what they read is who they're going to become. Mm-hmm. You know, it's changing their value system.
Well, I think that's why people are fighting so much with the libraries today about what books they're letting in.
Unbelievable.
Because they want people to be influenced by them.
Yeah, it does influence them.
They wouldn't be fighting so hard if it didn't matter.
The things the kids watch today. I mean, if I had young children, they would not be watching TV, would not have a computer screen, and not have an iPhone. It's crazy stuff. It's so powerful in children's lives. They need to be free to be children.
I was talking to one homeschool mom yesterday, and we were talking about her daughter. I was like, your daughter's really smart. Like, she's good at a lot of different things. And she says, yeah, growing up, we didn't really do screen time. We did hobbies. I was like, that's cool. So she's like really well-rounded as a person. I was like, this is just cool.
Look at my daughter. Yeah. She did most of her homeschooling in a tree. In a tree fort.
Okay, that's the way it should be done. I think that's awesome.
Yeah. And she spent probably half of her day just drawing. She was drawing horses at 3.
Wow.
Yeah. And
that's crazy.
Yeah,
she's an amazing artist. I've seen her stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I wish you'd give me something for Father's Day coming up. Okay, so let's bring this to a close. So we are what we read. The story we started with was Tales of the Resistance with Thespia, the most beautiful player at all. The Baker Who Loved Bread, the Princess Amanda and the Dragon. They are just timeless stories. Cinderella, based on the gospel.
Yeah.
You know, Snow White. You know, just all of these classic stories. And today, we're so far from that, but we can bring it back again.
Oh, that's why we're having this podcast, because there's so much beautiful, bright hope, and it is so amazing.
We have 272 books right now that God has allowed us to put back in print.
Yeah.
And we're just getting ready to buy a new bindery piece of equipment.
Yay!
It's going to allow us to go from 100 to 200 books a day to 800 to 1,000 books a day.
Better quality, too.
Yeah, so we'll be sewing the books rather than gluing them.
Awesome.
So God's been very good to us, and we're going to continue to grow. We want to reach this world for Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Otherwise, Jesus said the road that leads to destruction is broad and wide, and many are going to go in that direction. But the road that leads to life is straight and narrow, and only a few are going to be there that find it. We want to help the many to find it. Yeah. So, Molly, thanks for joining me once again.
Yeah, this has been a good conversation, and I actually think it would be really awesome for people to check out our podcast series on Proverbs wisdom lessons. It talks a lot about what you were saying.
That's
from
excellent.
Chapters 1 through 9 Proverbs. Let's talk about, the verses one by one, the simple person, knowledgeable, wise.
How do they find it?
That's right here on this channel, Fasten Like Nails, and you can look it up. There are 12 lessons in there with an intro and some 2-parters. But
what do you mean on the channel, Fasten Like Nails?
So you could get that on, probably however they're listening to this, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, we're on Google Podcasts, and I think we're on YouTube too.
So they could just go there and they can find the Proverbs teaching?
Yep.
Oh,
and
neat.
if you're like me and you like reading things a little more, you can go to markhamby.net. His blogs are all on there on the Proverbs wisdom lessons.
Well, I'd like to see that myself.
Yeah. So thanks for joining us. Doctor, this has been so fun.
Thanks, Molly.
Yeah. Let's do it again sometime.
Another Fastened Like Nails.
You've been listening to Fastened Like Nails, a presentation of Lamplighter Ministries. Our mission is to make ready a people prepared for the Lord by building Christ-like character, one story at a time. To learn more about our family collection of rare books, dramatic audios, or guild programs, visit lamplighter.net. To hear more podcasts, search for Fastened Like Nails wherever you listen to podcasts.